This week's Torah portion is Mishpatim. And what we discussed last week, if you recall, last week we talked about the 10 Commandments, and not just the actual 10 Commandments, but the whole ceremony and the whole procedure and preparation that we read in those verses prior to the 10 Commandments. And I mentioned last week that there are really two elements to this whole ceremony, this whole event, okay? One is the 10 Commandments themselves, the actual reciting by God directly of the 10 Commandments and the direct revelation of God to the nation at Sinai. But the second is something we call covenant. And covenant was something that was hinted at in some of the verses we looked at. But this is what I want to focus on today, because in addition to the actual 10 Commandments, there was a covenant entered into at Sinai, at Mount Sinai. And this is what I'd like to explore today, to see exactly what is this covenant, when does it happen, and what is its content, what is its message. Okay, so first, if we go to the very beginning of the Torah portion, we're in Exodus chapter 21. Exodus chapter 21 begins, this is the beginning of the Torah portion, these are the laws that you shall place before them. Okay, God is speaking to Moses and he's saying these are the laws you shall place before them. And one of the questions is, when does this happen? When is God actually speaking these laws? When does this all take place? So if we go back a little bit, just a few verses, in chapter 20, verse 18, this is something we read last week. This is after the 10 Commandments, after we learn about during the 10 Commandments that the nation was very frightened and Moses had to calm them down. And then we have on verse 18, so the people remained at a distance while Moses approached the thick cloud where God was. Okay, so Moses at that point is going up to Mount Sinai towards the cloud. And while he is up there, then we begin with chapter 21. God then speaks all these laws to Moses. Okay. And over the next few chapters, we have a lot of laws, and that in itself can be the content for many, many, many classes, but we're not going to do that today. And then we start with chapter 24, okay? Chapter 24, we have as follows. God said to Moses, come up. By the way, this is a bad translation. I can tell you right off. It's very important. In Hebrew, it says the El Moshe Amar, and he said to Moses. But the word Amar, we have different tenses of verbs. Okay, the word means said, but does it mean he said, he has said, he did say, he had said? Okay, the particular tense that is here is actually past perfect. So if I were to more accurately translate this verse, it would be, and he had said to Moses, okay, come up to the Lord with Aaron, Nadav, and Abihu, and the 70 elders, etc. So basically, the use of the past perfect right away indicates to us that it's taking us back to something that had happened prior to what we had just read. Okay, that's verse 1. Verse 2, Moses alone shall come shall come to God, and they will not. It's talking about the different statuses. Different people get closer. Moses is the only one that really goes all the way up to God. The nation will not go with them. Okay, this is actually then just a repeat of the instructions we read prior to the 10 Commandments, where God is saying, please be careful. Moses is the only one who can come up, and everybody else has to keep their distance. And then we get to verse 3. And here our verb goes back to the normal past, something just saying what happened. Moses went and repeated to the people all the commands or all the laws. The people answered with one voice, saying, all the things that the Lord has commanded, we will do. Moses then wrote down all the words of God. Okay. When did this happen? And again, if initially we had something in past perfect, now we have ordinary past. So when did this actually happen? The use of the word laws is very interesting because it's the same word in Hebrew Mishpatim that opens up the Torah portion at the beginning of 21. If you recall, what we just said now was that these are the laws that God spoke to Moses right after the Ten Commandments when he went up to Mount Sinai. So it's basically, if I read this in this context, what am I understanding? After the Ten Commandments are spoken, Moses goes up to God. During that period, there's a series of laws that God gives to Moses. Then Moses comes back. This is a short sojourn with God, okay? This just goes up, he gets these instructions, he comes back. And he tells the nation what God told them, all these laws. And at that point, the nation says, good, we're on board. And then Moses writes the words of the Lord. What does he write? He writes this past few chapters of laws, most of the current Torah portion. That's what he writes. And then in the middle of verse 4, we really start a new story. What happens next? Moses got up in the morning and he builds an altar, 12 pillars for symbolizing the 12 tribes. Okay, and then we have a description here of a covenant ceremony. We have an altar. We have sacrifices that are brought. We have the blood from the sacrifices are tossed around the altar. They're also put in certain basins. And then in verse 7, we have as follows. Then he took the book of the covenant and he read it in the ears to the ears of the nation. And they said, everything that God has said, we will do and we will listen. And then we have the rest of the ceremony, and Moses took the blood and he threw it over the people, and he said, this is the blood of the covenant that the Lord now makes with you concerning all of these spoken words. Okay? So here we have an entire ceremony, a ceremony that involves sacrifices, blood, and actually we see that there's an execution of a covenant. When exactly does this happen? So if based upon this analysis that I just took you to, if I'm going to summarize, now what I'm putting forward now is my suggestion. There are many, many different suggestions because the text itself is quite confusing. As I mentioned last week, Moses has gone up and down and up and down, and it's kind of hard to figure out exactly when he went up and did what, okay? But if I sat and put this together, and I'm sure there are other people that agree with me, but it's just one suggestion. Basically, this is the chronology as I see it, okay? First, before the Ten Commandments, we have God, he goes up to God, he gets instructions, he prepares the nation, and he is down at the bottom of the hill with the nation when the Ten Commandments actually happens. Then we have the Ten Commandments. Then he goes back up again. Now, the going back up again is basically something that we've seen in two different scriptures that we read both of them today. But just to remind you, one is chapter 20, verse 18, where it says Moses approached the thick cloud where God was. And the second one was verse 2 in chapter 24, where we are right now, where it says, and only Moses will approach God. Okay? It's the same exact going up. It's the going up Mount Sinai right after the Ten Commandments, during which time Moses received the laws and statutes that are set forth in chapters 21, 22, and 23. Okay? Then he comes down, and after he comes down, he writes down those rules. Okay? This is not the text of the covenant. These are a series of laws. In fact, what you may say, keep in mind, we have the 5 books of Moses. Moses writes them all down. And there's actually different theories, 2 basic approaches actually that our sages take as to when he wrote this down. Some say he wrote the whole thing before he died. Others say, no, he wrote it in stages. And so basically what we can interpret this as saying, this Torah portion, these 3 chapters, he wrote right now. He wrote some before, he wrote some after. These 3 chapters he wrote down right now. And then, okay, we have a covenant ceremony. And that's what we read now in chapter 24, verses 3 to 11 actually is the whole covenant ceremony is set forward. And then after the covenant ceremony is finished, in verse 18, at the end, starting at verse 15, chapter 24, verse 15, he goes up again. And Moses went up the mountain, and the cloud covered the mountain. And then we have here in verse 18, and Moses went into the cloud. He went up to the hill, and Moses was up on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. So the 40 days and 40 nights, that long time that Moses is up there on Mount Sinai, happens after this covenant, okay? Now the question is, what is this covenant? What is the nature of this covenant? What does it mean? And what is its text? Okay. Now, I must say, there are people who say that the text of the covenant are the 3 chapters 21, 22, and 23 of Exodus. I don't like that interpretation because we know that covenant, certainly covenant between God and the nation, has a certain structure. And I think it helps us to understand what covenant is if we think of it in terms of a legal contract, because that's really what a covenant is. It's a treaty, or it's a contract. And if you think about it, what is a contract? Always sets out the do's and the don'ts. It's and it has conditions. And it has to be parallel. So basically, a contract will usually say one side promises to give something to the other side, and in exchange, the other side gives something back to the first side. And if one side breaches its obligations under the contract, the other side is no longer obligated to do its portion. Okay, so it's a very parallel, symmetrical kind of situation. It's a little odd to talk about a covenant between God and the nation, or God and any individual human being, as being parallel, but indeed, when we see the covenants in the Bible, they are very parallel to a certain degree. Okay. Now, okay, so actually that has to do with the text of the covenant. Okay, that's just setting out what do I mean by covenant. I want to get to the actual discussion of the text of the covenant in a minute, but first, I want to talk about the relationship between the two parties of a covenant. It is usually a special relationship. It is an exclusive relationship, okay? And the fact that you have a covenant or a treaty or a contract between two people means that those two people have agreed to something that is different from what everybody else usually does. In other words, they've created a relationship. They haven't just, written down some words on a piece of paper. They've created a relationship. And covenant, I would say, is a stronger version of a contract. It's a much more long-term type of thing that has to do with the relationship. So let's take a look at covenants that we have encountered in the past. And before Exodus, okay, the only covenant that we've dealt with at all between God and human beings is the covenant with the forefathers, and of course the most prominent ones with Abraham. And a classic one actually is in Genesis 15. Genesis 15, there is also a covenant. Notice here, the covenant ceremony is all about a ceremony. We have sacrifices, animals. It's quite a drawn-out ceremony. The covenant that I'm referring to in Genesis 15 is also a drawn-out ceremony. It's not sacrifices, but if you remember, it's called the covenant of the pieces, that Abraham has to take a number of different animals and birds. He cuts them in half and he puts them on two sides, and it's as if he and God are walking between these pieces. And many researchers have said that this was a certain type of ceremony that was common in the ancient Eastern areas of two men making a contract. They would walk between these kind of pieces. So God is kind of walking. It's, Abraham's in a sleep, but it really, when you see that ceremony, it tells you, whoa, this is covenant. This is serious. Okay. But what's the nature of the covenant there? We look at Genesis 15, verse 18. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, I have given this land to your children, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates. And then it lists all the various nations that will come in under this covenant, that not the covenant, but the gift of the land that God is giving to Abram. So here, the covenant, we don't see that much this idea of commandments or what one has to do, what the other has to do. It's less reciprocal here.
A lesson from Israel.
What this covenant does is clearly set Abraham aside as unique. And it establishes a unique relationship between God and Abraham that will be carried through, of course, to his children. And that relationship is built on the children, which will be precious to God, special to God, a unique relationship, and it surrounds the land. Okay? Now, let's now look at some of the verses in last week's portion that when we began the discussion of this whole big ceremony and this hoopla of the Ten Commandments, we talked about some of the at the beginning, the introduction really set forth a number of different elements. And it's these elements that I want to focus on today because they're directly related to covenant. These are the verses in the introductory section to the Ten Commandments that talk about covenant. So if you look at chapter 19, verse 4, you've seen what I did to the Egyptians, and I've carried you on the wings of Israel, and I will bring you to me. I will bring you to me. It's an expression of a very unique and exclusive kind of relationship. And now, if you listen to my voice and you observe my covenant, you will be for me a treasure among nations, because the land is all mine. You will be for me a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. So here we have language of covenant, but God is defining the nature of the covenant, not the text of the covenant, not the content of the covenant. The nature of the covenant is establishing a special relationship between God and the nation. The nation is set in words of a holy nation, a kingdom of priests, and a unique, a special nation, the word skula. So that is very, very important and very significant here. Now let's go to the text of the covenant. So I started saying before, a text of a covenant is usually reciprocal. One of the covenants that is very clearly laid out for us in the Bible is in Deuteronomy 28. Deuteronomy 28, the pattern in this covenant is very, very clear. Deuteronomy 28, verse 1, now if you listen to the voice of the Lord your God, to obey and follow his commandments that I command you today, and then if you do that, the Lord your God will set you above all the other nations of the earth, and all these blessings will come upon you if you listen to the voice of your God, of the Lord your God. Okay? Then we have the parallel. That's if you're good. If you're bad, in verse 15. But if you do not obey the commandments of the Lord your God that you are to follow today, all these curses will come upon you. That is the pattern of a covenant. If you obey the rule, here are the rules. If you obey the rules, you will get all these blessings. If you disobey the rules, you will get all these curses. Now, at the end of that covenant in Deuteronomy 28, the very end of Deuteronomy 28, when all the curses have been finished, what do we read? These are the words of the covenant that God commanded to Moses to enter into with the nation of Israel in the land of Moab, in addition to the covenant that he executed with them at Horeb. Horeb is another word for Sinai. So what we learn here is that this covenant in Deuteronomy happens 40 years later. This is at the end, just before they're going to be entering to the land of Israel. There's a covenant there with a very set pattern. And it's relating back to a covenant in Sinai. It's basically saying, okay, we had two covenants, one in Sinai, one here. And therefore, you would expect that the covenant in Sinai would be very similar, certainly a similar form, and it may also have similar text. Where do we find a covenant of similar form earlier on? Well, that's in Leviticus. If you look at Leviticus 26, verse 3, it begins as follows. If you follow my laws and faithfully observe my commandments, then I will grant you your rains in their season, so that the earth shall yield its produce and the trees of the field their fruit. And it goes on and say all these wonderful, wonderful things that will happen to you and to your land. And then we also have the parallel, if you don't, in verse 14. But if you do not obey me and do not observe all these commandments, if you reject my laws and spurn my rules, so that you do not observe all my commandments, and you break my covenant, then I will wreak misery upon you, consumption, fever, cause you pain. And there's a whole list of terrible curses and terrible things that will happen. Okay? So this is exactly the same kind of thing. So you're going to say to me, but Leviticus, this is at the end of Leviticus. What does this have to do with Sinai? If you look at the beginning of chapter 25, you will see the beginning in chapter 25 to the end of Leviticus, there is it's a section of Leviticus that really doesn't belong here. What does it say in chapter 25? The Lord spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai. The end of Leviticus really belongs in Exodus for different reasons, and now is not the time to discuss this and the many interpretations of why this happened. Just to remind you, all of Leviticus is God speaking to Moses in the tabernacle months after Sinai. And all of a sudden, beginning in 25, we have God speaking to Moses on Mount Sinai. This is clearly a section of the Bible that chronologically belongs earlier, but for whatever reason is put later, okay? This, I believe, the text of the covenant in chapter 26, which clearly was spoken at Sinai, I believe this is the text of the covenant that is referred to in our Torah portion this week in chapter 24, okay? Now let's see, what is the essence of this covenant? What have we learned from this? Okay. So first of all, the essence of these covenants, both in Leviticus and in Deuteronomy, is all very, very much tied up with the land. The blessings to the land of Israel is a blessings of prosperity and success of the nation of Israel in the land. And the curse begins with famine and enemies and all kinds of terrible things that happen to the nation in the land of Israel, and ultimately exile. The land itself is the first prize. The nation of Israel obeying the covenant, they end up getting the land. Okay, so this land of Israel becomes an essential component in this covenantal relationship that God is entering into with the nation of Israel. If I'm going to now put this all together, what does this tell us about Revelation? We have done this now in 2 Torah portions. We've seen, I think, a more complete picture than usually. Usually we talk about the 10 Commandments. We read the 10 Commandments. What I tried to do here was create an understanding of the contents and the entire ceremony, the entire procedure. Okay? We saw 2 main components. One, the actual direct revelation at Sinai when God spoke the 10 Commandments. And as we saw that last week, it's tremendous, it's fireworks. It's mystery. It's an amazing show. Grandeur, okay? We have this idea of the cloud on the mountain. We have the idea of distance, all creating this quite supernatural, awe-inspiring event that is all tied around God's revelation to the nation of Israel as a whole. It's just an amazing thing. It's the experience itself that is so amazing here. In many ways, I know people put a lot of attention to the text of the Ten Commandments, and I think the text of the Ten Commandments is very, very important. But the whole experience goes way beyond the actual what are the Ten Commandments. It's something so much more powerful than that. And as we noted last week, it's not just a one-off thing, because God sets up ongoing revelation and communication with the nation through the tabernacle. So it's a one-off enormous event that will have a certain level of continuity through the experience of the temple and the tabernacle. The second element is what we discussed today, is the element of covenant. And there's nothing supernatural about this. And really, I mean, anything having to do with God and human beings is supernatural, but there's no thunder and lightning and whatever. This is a very serious legal relationship between God and his people. It involves commandments, specific rules that need to be obeyed. And if they're not obeyed, consequences that happens. There's mutuality. God is giving us blessings, provided we obey his rules. If we don't obey his rules, he withdraws the blessings. This is a whole different kind of content and of an atmosphere than we have in the fireworks of Sinai. But it is no less important. But it's not a dry contract. It's not, I want to buy your house and here's my money, give me the house. Intrinsic to the covenant is the unique relationship, is the Am Skula, is the Jewish people being the treasured nation of God. The very fact that it's a covenant talks about an exclusive covenantal or contractual relationship. And tied in that relationship, as I said, is the relationship between the God of Israel, the people of Israel, and the land of Israel. And if I am just going to say one, if I read from the covenant in Leviticus 26, just to repeat this, because it's just a beautiful, beautiful line in verse 5, actually. Your threshing shall overtake the vintage, your vintage shall overtake the sowing. You shall eat your fill of bread and dwell safely and securely in your land. Dwelling securely in your land. Isn't that the ultimate blessing that we wish for us and for God to give to us? It's certainly something that today in Israel, and ever since Israel has been reestablished as this modern state of Israel, we certainly hope and pray for being able to live safely and securely in the land. I think the beginnings of all of that as a nation is what we saw here in these chapters in Exodus, the covenant and revelation, the special relationship between God and the Jewish people. That's it for today. If you have any comments, I have some time and I can hang around and hear what you have to say or questions.
Sondra, it's Vanessa speaking.
Yes.
Remind me the difference between a covenant and a promise.
A promise is one way.
Okay.
And as I make a promise to you, and actually I have some legal training. I remember our first week in law school. This was one of the first things they were teaching us. What's the difference between a contract and a promise?
Right.
Promise, first of all, it's not something that you can enforce. I made a promise out of the goodness of my heart. If I don't keep it, you can say I don't keep my promises, but there's no way you can take me to court on that. A contract is a whole different thing, and a contract has to have two sides, and it has to have each side giving something.
Okay.
Doing something.
Lovely. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Can I say something here?
Pardon? Yes.
When we are talking about a Brit, this small world, אם אתם תעשו את, if you
Right.
do your,
Right.
so this small world is really like the promise between the two sides. If you don't do yours, I cannot do mine.
Exactly. Very good. That is it's the key here. The fact that it's conditional. every side has its blessings or its curses, and all depends on what the other side does.
Sondra,
Yes.
have you written about this? Do you have any like an essay or a book? I am just so blown away with the way in which the clarity with which you're explaining things, and I would like to see that in a book.
Well, I'm constantly coming up with new ideas and new teachings, and I just like teaching them rather than writing them. I mean, I did write that one book. Shabbat Shalom is a book I wrote that has some of my thoughts in it. I think you've seen that book, haven't you?
Sure.
Yeah. So that's the only time I ever wrote anything in an ordinary format. I just prefer teaching, and as new ideas come in, I teach it. But
I know.
There is so
know
much
that.
that we need to learn and understand and know about what covenant means.
Lots of books, people.
Yeah,
There's lots
yeah,
of books out
absolutely. Well,
there.
there are people that have written about this in different contexts, and again, the stuff that I'm reading when I'm studying Bible, it's all in Hebrew. But I'm sure there's some of the stuff is also written in English.
I'm sure there is, for sure.
Yeah. Anyway, this is just my, I'm constantly learning, and I think that really is the key to Bible. Anyone who's teaching Bible, you have to constantly be learning Bible, because it's always, you're always coming up with new ideas, new understandings. As you get older, as you have more experience, and the process of teaching and learning is a process that goes together.
So true.
So we should just keep learning with each other all the time, and then,
Amen.
who needs to write it down? We're just learning. We're studying.
That's right.
Quick
Yeah,
question.
you're right. That's what we need to do.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Diane. Oh,
Yes.
is it? Yeah.
It was Diane. I went on a tour with you with Wendy McCusker several years ago. What was the name of the community that you took us into? I can't find my notes.
Oh, I take people into communities. Tell me something about it.
Well, it was special. That's all I remember you saying. It was special. And I wrote everything down. You taught us now. I can't find it.
Well, you know what? Send me an email with the dates of your tour, and I then will be able to locate when it was and what we saw.
I'll do just that. Thank you. Your
Wonderful.
teachers
Thank
are
you.
so rich, and I enjoy it.
Thank
Toda
you.
rabah.
Thank you so much. And give my regards to Wendy. I haven't heard her or seen of her in so long.
I'll do that.
Okay.
Shalom, shalom.
Shalom. Okay.
Can you tell us?
Can I just
So Meg and then Jane. Yes.
The lady just reminded me when she asked you the name of a place. The place where the children went back to rebuild it.
Kfar Etzion.
Which one?
Kfar, Kfar, Etzion.
Oh, yes.
Etzion.
Yeah, you took us there, and I
Yes,
remember that.
very
I wasn't-
special place.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank
Yes.
you.
You're welcome. Jane, you had a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you, Sondra, about Exodus 24, verse 10. There is the really lovely description that they saw something like the pavement of sapphire stone. Does that have
Exodus 24, verse 10.
Yeah, does that have any particular significance as to why it's named? Described?
That is the verse I was going to skip, because it is the most, those two verses, 10 and 11, are probably the most difficult verses in the Bible to understand.
Right.
It's very, you don't know, it's some kind of mystical revelation that these people seeing some kind of, I don't know, revelation of God. And there's something criticism here also. End of verse 11, they saw God and then they ate and drank. There's like something jarring about this. You know, if you've just experienced the most amazing revelation, you don't sit and have a picnic. Okay. Now, what we may do, maybe I'll make a note of it, because there's one interpretation that I actually like very, very much that connects this particular verse to something that happens in Leviticus. So maybe I'm going to make a note to discuss that when we get to Leviticus. How's that?
Fabulous. Okay. Lovely. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Yeah, real treasure.
Okay. Anyway, great to see you all today. Have a wonderful weekend. Shabbat Shalom.
Hope you enjoyed that video. And we'd like to be sure you're getting all of our video content. So just click on the subscribe button below as well as on the notification bell. And that way you will have easy access to all our material. We look forward to staying in touch with you. God bless you and have a wonderful day.